Good morning, fourth graders. It's Thursday, April 23rd. This is lesson 9.3a, which means part 1, equivalent fractions and decimals. I'm going to be doing part of 9.3 today and the other part tomorrow. There's just a lot to digest in this section, so I kind of wanted to split it up a little bit for you so your brain can just process it in chunks. This lesson is going to be very similar to when we've done equivalent fractions in the past. So you might remember when we've done this before. Hopefully you do. We would say like 3/4 equals something eighths. Well, we knew, okay, 4 times 2 is 8, so I have to do whatever I do the bottom, I have to do the top. So I'd have to do 3 times 2 and get 6. So these fractions would be equivalent because they take up the same amount of space, they're just broken into different size pieces. So this is going to be the exact same thing, except it's with tenths and hundredths, and it's going to connect it back to decimals. So it's this idea, but we're throwing in the decimals part of it with it too. So I'm on page 507, and I'm starting with this problem. Daniel spent a day hiking through a wildlife preserve. During the first hour of the hike, he drank 6/10 liter of water. How many hundredths of a liter did he drink? So it says write 6/10 as an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 100. So you might be able to skip the model and go straight to here and figure out your mystery number up here. But I'm going to use the model to help us figure this out first, just as a refresher. So I'm going to color in 6/10 of this model. So this model is broken into 10 pieces, so I'm going to color 6 of them. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there is 6 pieces colored in. So that's how much space this fraction takes up in this model. So I'm going to color in the same amount of space in this 100s grid to help me figure out what my mystery number is going to be. So because I have 6/10 colored in, I have to color in 6 groups of 10. So here's one group of 10, 2 groups of 10, 3 groups of 10, 4 groups of 10, 5 groups of 10, and 6 groups of 10. So that takes up the same amount of space, but 6 groups of 10 we know is 60. Which you might remember doing this without the models from before. If we had this problem, we knew, okay, 10 times 10 gives us 100. Whatever we do to the bottom, we have to do to the top. So 6 times 10 would be 60. And that's what they do with you over here. So we know we're going from tenths to hundredths. So we're going to take each number and multiply it by 10. Because each space over here is multiplied by 10 because we're breaking it into 10 pieces. So 6 spaces times 10 pieces compared to 10 spaces with 10 pieces. That's 100 pieces, which would be the whole graph that's not filled in. And then 6 times 10 is 60. So it works very similarly to equivalent fractions that we've done before, except for it's having you work in the hundreds, which we didn't do a whole lot of before. And now it's going to connect it back to decimals. So it's going to say, it says, write 6/10 as a decimal. 6/10 is the same as 6/10 and 0 hundredths. So, or 60 hundredths. So let me show you how this works. There's no whole model, so I'm going to put the 0 there, and then the decimal point. It's 6/10 filled in, so I'm going to put the 6 in the tenths place. And I had no extra 100ths filled in. If you were to just look at just the hundreds model, you could say that there's 60 100ths, but if I just put the 6 in the hundredths place, that would just mean 6 little squares. So when you're representing 60 100ths, you have to think of in terms of, okay, What does 60 mean? 60 means there are 6 groups of 10. So that means that I have to put the 6 in the 10th place. This is where decimals get a little confusing. So just keep in mind, like I said, every time you're writing a decimal, think of a chart like this. Think about what each section means and how it compares to what you've been doing. So it says, so Daniel drank 0.60. So 0 wholes and 60 100ths or 6/10. 60 100ths and 6/10 are the same thing. Or 60 100ths liter of water. So then it says, explain why 6/10 is equivalent to 60 100ths. Well, we would use the same explanation that we've used before with equivalent fractions. 60, let me see here, 6/10 and 60, okay. 6/10 and 60 100ths equal each other because they take up the same amount of space. They represent the same amount. They just are broken into different size pieces. Just like we've done with fractions like this before. They represent the same amount. They're just broken into different size pieces. All right, turn the page. I'm on page 508. It says Jasmine collected 0.30 liters of water in a jar during a rainstorm. So that would be 0 wholes and 3/10 or 30 100ths. How many tenths of a liter did she collect? Equivalent decimals are decimals that name the same amount. So like we just talked about. You can write 0.30 as a decimal that names tenths. So write 0.30 as an equivalent decimal. So this is skipping the fraction part and going straight for the decimals. So that's one way you could use it, is use a place value chart like we have here. So it says, let's see here, it says show 0.30 in a place value chart. So that would be 0 ones, just like here, decimal, and 3/10 and 0 100ths. Remember, the tenths is how many full sticks did you color in, and the 100ths is how many extra squares do you have. There are no 100ths in this one, so it would just be the 3 sticks. So 3/10, 3 groups of 10. And then I've got 0.30, so 0 and 30 100ths is equivalent to 3/10, because I have a 3 in the 10ths place. So it's also, 0.30 is also 0.3. So this is a really good point to bring up. With decimals, this decimal equals this decimal. They equal the same amount. We're like, well, wait, Mrs. Spears, that one's 30 and this one's just 3. Well, keep in mind what the place values mean. This first place value after the decimal means tenths. Regardless if there's a 0 here or not, it still means tenths. So this is representing 3/10, and this is also representing 3/10 because they both have a 3 in the 10ths place. So with decimals, zeros on the end, past the decimal, zeros on the end don't matter. This equals this. It's the same thing. So this 0 doesn't matter because it doesn't change how much this represents. This still represents 3/10, and this also represents 3/10, even though it doesn't have the 0. So that's why sometimes with decimals, you'll see it with the 0 on the end, and sometimes you won't. They mean the same exact same thing because of where the numbers are and what those numbers mean. So keep that in mind with this. All right. Another way says write 0.30, so 0 and 30 100ths. So 30 100ths and 3/10 are the same thing. As a fraction with a denominator of 10. So we know that we need to write it as a fraction. So because it's written with a 3 in the 10ths place and a 0 in the 100ths place, that means it's 30 100ths. Because it would be 30 of those little boxes filled in. 3 whole groups of 10, but 30 little boxes. Because it wants us to write it in hundredths, we have to think of how many little boxes is it, how many out of 100 would be it be. So 30 100ths written as a fraction is, oh, whoops, hang on. Your book just had you write it a couple times in a couple different ways. It means the same thing though. So then it says the directions said to write it with a denominator of 10. So we're working backwards. We're taking 30 hundredths and we're trying to figure out what number over 10 equals the same amount of space as 30 over 100. So we know with this one, you can either think of it with multiplication. So we've done it like this before. You know, from here to here is to multiply by 10. Which means from here to here, you also have to multiply by 10. So what number times 10 is 30? 3. 3 times 10 will give you 30. So with this one, they have you use division in the book, but you can also use it as multiplication. Just keep in mind, whatever you do to the bottom, you do to the top, and you go the same direction. If it's multiplying by 10 going this way, it has to also be multiplying by 10 going the other way too. If it's multiplying by 10 going the opposite way compared to the bottom, it doesn't work. So be careful with that. Those rules all still apply in this situation. Even though we're working with different kinds of fractions, rules still apply. So this one they have you divide. So 30 divided by 10. But whatever I did to the top, I have to do to the bottom. So divide by 10 on here as well. So 10 divided by 10, or 100 divided by 10 is 10. And then 30 divided by 10 is 3. So Jasmine collected 3/10 or 3/10 liter of water. So 30 hundredths and 3/10 equal the same amount of space. It's just written in different size pieces. This is written in groups of 10. This is written in groups of 100. So, or not groups of 100, but you know what I mean. This is broken into size 10 pieces and size 100 pieces. Take up the same amount of space. If I were to take one of those 100 grid models and shade in 30 100ths, it would be the same amount of space as 3/10. 3 groups of 10. All right, moving on down here. Sorry about the light in my video. The light's coming in my window, so it looks kind of funny. All right, write 4/10 as hundredths. So we're going to write it as an equivalent fraction. So we're trying to figure out 4/10 equals what over 100? Well, I know that 10 times 10 gives me 100. Whatever 2 I do to the bottom, I have to do to the top. Which means that 4 times 10 is 40. So my fraction is 40 over 100. And then if we write it as a decimal, there's no whole number. So there's a 0 in the ones place. This decimal is, or this fraction is set as 4/10, which means I can put the 4 in the 10ths place. And there's no hundredths on here. It's not written in hundredths. So we don't need to worry about this one. We could put a 0 there. So this one you could write 2 kinds of decimals for. You could write it like this. 0 and 40 hundredths. But that also equals 0 and 4/10, because 4/10 and 40 hundredths are the same amount of space. Just like over here, 4/10 and 40 hundredths are the same amount of space. 40 hundredths, 40/10, same amount of space. So either one of those is fine as an answer for this one. All right, so now I'm on page 509. It says, write the number as hundredths in fraction form and decimal form. So for this section, from here on out, you have to definitely read your directions. Because they're going to switch back and forth between what form they want you to write it in. And they're also going to switch back and forth between whether they want it in tenths or hundredths. So make sure you read the directions. So when I did all these problems earlier, I went through and double checked all my directions. So it says write the number as hundredths. So I got to make sure whether when it's in fraction form, it has a denominator of 100. And when it's in decimal form, it's got something in both the tenths and the hundredths places. Okay? So what I like to do first is just deal with all the fractions first. Because I'm more familiar with fractions, you're already more familiar with fractions, I always like to just take whatever I've been given and start with the fraction part of it first. And then I move on to the decimals from there. So I start with the old and go with the new. So I'm going to turn this into 100ths. So I know my denominator has to be 100. So whatever I do to the bottom, I have to do to the top. So I knew that 10 times 10 gives me 100. So I have to do the same thing on the top. So 7/10 takes up the same amount of space as 70/100. But it wants me to write it in fraction and decimal form. So I'm going to think back to like one of these place value charts. Okay. So I know there's no whole number attached to this. So I'm going to put a 0 in the ones place, put my decimal, and then I'm going to write my decimal to represent my fraction. So I've got 70/100. 70/100 is the same thing as 7/10. So I'm going to put a 7 in the 10ths place and a 0 in the 100ths place. So I like to think of these as money too. Like think of this as 70 cents out of 100 cents, 100 cents being $1. That's how we would write 70 cents. So that's a great way to connect these two. You know, when you're doing decimals in 4th grade, you're only going to be working with the hundredths and the tenths places. So it's a great way to think of it in terms of money. So that's another way you can think of it if you need to. So this one, they gave me a decimal, and I'm going to turn that into a hundredths, fraction, and decimal. So I'm going to turn this into a fraction, because again, I like working with fractions more, so I'm going to stick with fractions first, and then I'll move on to back to the hundredths and the decimals. So you could also start with decimals if you really wanted to as well. It doesn't really matter which way you go with this. So I know that this is in the tenths place, so this is 5/10 because of where it's at. So I'm going to turn that into a tenths fraction. But my directions want everything in hundredths, so I'm going to turn this into hundredths. 10 times 10 is 100. I have to do 5 times 10, and that gives me 50, which in decimal form is 0.50. 0 and 50/100ths, or 0 and 5/10, which is the same thing as you have up here. Same thing with this one. Turn it into hundredths. Times 10 times 10 gives me 30, which as a decimal is 0 and 3/10, or 30/100ths. Same thing, same answer. Write the number as tenths in fraction form and decimal form. So it wants fractions and decimals again, but it wants it in tenths. So all of these are written in hundredths form, and we have to think backwards a little bit. But again, I like to start with the fractions and then come back to them. So if we're looking at this, this is a 4 in the tenths place and a 0 in the hundredths place, which means we have 40/100ths. So this is 40/100ths, which equals, in tenths, just 4/10, which written as a decimal is 0 and 4/10. All 4 of these numbers, this one included, all take up the same amount of space if you were to draw them in a model. All right, I have 80/100ths, so I gotta turn that into tenths. Well, 10 times 10 would be 100, so what number times 10 gives me 80? That'd be 8, which as a decimal is 0 and 8/10. And this one, this would be out of 10, so 10 times 10 is 100. Blank times 10 is 20, which would be 2. And that is 0 and 2/10. So some of you kind of have figured this out from when we did fractions before, but a little trick that you have to be careful with, but you can use, is when you see you have a number in the numerator and a number in the denominator that both have a 0 on them, you can actually cancel out a 0 for a 0. Now, if one has a 0 and the other one doesn't, you can't do that, or vice versa. But you can actually cancel out the zeros if there's 1 0 on top and 1 0 on the bottom. Same thing over here. There's a 0 here and a 0 here, so we can actually cancel those out. which gives us 2/10. So this one was 8/10. So that's a quick trick that you can use when going from hundredths to tenths. Just be careful, like I said, with it, because if you had like 8/10 and you crossed out the 10, that doesn't work. 8/1 is not the same thing as 8/10. So just make sure there's a 0 on top and a 0 on the bottom before you do that. All right, guys, so this is the end of this video. Today your assignment is to try your best on this one. I know I haven't done all the problems in this section, but it's okay. I think you'll catch on to it. Just try your best on this one. If you're not sure, join me for Zoom at 1:30 and I'll do it with you. So, like I said, I will do the rest of this tomorrow to go over it again. So if you try this and you're not able to do Zoom, that's okay. Just tune in to tomorrow's video and see how you take how you did and compare it to this one. And then tomorrow your assignment is to do the Google form. You guys have any questions, just send me a message online and I will get back to you as soon as I can. I'll see you guys in the next video.